Well, the finance minister was outselling his budget to business groups today, emphasizing investments to increase Canadian exports.
We have the most ambitious infrastructure plan in the G7. Canada has 3 oceans. You know, we can go to the Arctic, we can go to the Pacific, we can go to the Atlantic.
The Prime Minister has set a goal of doubling non-U.S. exports over the next decade. And today, the Ministers of Transport and International Trade announced $6 billion to boost trade infrastructure such as rails, roads, and ports over the next 7 years.
Canada has just taken a step that could redraw the entire map of North American trade. With one announcement, a $6 billion commitment to expand railways, modernize ports, and build the inland terminals that keep exports moving, Ottawa sent a message far bigger than the dollar figure. Canada is building a new economic future, and that future is not centered around the United States. As President Donald Trump leans deeper into tariffs and weaponized trade politics, Canada is quietly constructing the physical foundation of a global export strategy. The contrast is unmistakable. While the U.S. is tightening borders, Canada is opening gateways. The announcement came directly from International Trade Minister Minister Sidhu, following the series of diplomatic missions that have put Canada at the center of investment conversations across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Sidhu laid out the broader logic behind the $6 billion package. Canada intends to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade, and that requires more than treaties and promises. It requires ships that can dock, rails that can move goods, airports that can move people, and terminals that can relieve bottlenecks before they even happen. The interview also revealed something striking. The United Arab Emirates, through its sovereign wealth funds, has earmarked up to $70 billion for potential investment inside Canada. That's on top of ongoing discussions with Saudi Arabia, Malaysia's Petronas, Singapore's GIC, and new defense and industrial contracts out of Germany. For a country that once relied overwhelmingly on a single export destination, Canada is suddenly being courted from every direction. But the most important line of the interview came when Sidhu pointed directly at the elephant in the room. At a time when we're having serious consequences of policies that's set by our southern neighbors, we need to be able to diversify. It was a rare, candid acknowledgement that the United States, Canada's biggest customer for a century, has become one of its biggest vulnerabilities. This is the context in which the $6 billion announcement lands. Canada is not simply upgrading infrastructure, it is repositioning itself as a global supplier with new priorities and new partners. For generations, Canada built its economy on the assumption that the United States would always be the reliable, stable anchor of North American trade. Today, that assumption no longer holds. Trump's revived tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and machinery have pushed supply chains into disarray and raised costs across multiple sectors. U.S. manufacturers are already reporting shortages and higher input prices, according to recent reporting from Reuters and Bloomberg. The White House calls the tariffs leverage. Canadians call them collateral damage. This is why the $6 billion plan matters. It signals that Canada refuses to be boxed in by unpredictable U.S. politics. Instead of asking how to cope with American volatility, Ottawa is building the infrastructure it needs to sell to the rest of the world: Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and eventually Africa. It is a pivot from reactive to proactive, from dependence to autonomy, from one market to many. The surge of investment interest isn't happening by accident. Countries everywhere are re-engineering supply chains and want partners who can deliver energy, minerals, clean power, and advanced logistics without political whiplash. Canada fits that profile: a stable democracy with abundant resources and a clean grid admired across the G7. The UAE's $70 billion interest is simply the headline. Saudi Arabia sees Canada as a long-term energy partner. Petronas is expanding LNG involvement. Singapore's major port operators are scouting Canadian gateways. German defense firms see opportunities in Canadian shipyards. Even Indo-Pacific partners like Japan and Korea are circling for deeper ties. What unites all these players is the search for reliability, something in short supply as the U.S.-China rivalry accelerates. Canada's credibility is becoming its greatest economic asset. But credibility alone is not enough. Canada needs the ability to move goods quickly and at scale. That is what today's infrastructure plan is designed to guarantee. Export infrastructure decides who wins and who loses in global trade. Ports determine whether ships wait hours or days. Railways determine whether a mine in Alberta or a factory in Ontario can reach Asia fast enough to compete. Inland terminals decide whether exporters can bypass congestion altogether. Airports dictate how quickly high-value goods reach clients. In this context, the $6 billion investment is not optional. It is the price of ambition. Without capacity, Canada cannot hit its target of $300 billion in non-U.S. exports. Without modern ports and terminals, Canadian businesses will be trapped paying soaring shipping rates with no path to new markets. Sea-Doo captured the logic clearly. You can't double non-U.S. exports without adding capacity, and that's exactly what we're doing. Meanwhile, the United States is tied up in internal battles over tariffs, court challenges, and rising protectionism. Canada, in contrast, is presenting itself as a stable alternative for global industry. One country is tightening, the other is expanding. In a world drifting toward economic nationalism, Canada is charting a different path, one based on openness and predictability. Trump's America is doubling down on tariffs. China is pulling industries inward. Europe is tightening subsidy rules. Canada is doing the opposite, inviting capital in, building exporting power out, and positioning itself as the only G7 economy offering long-term stability, clean energy, and access to major markets simultaneously. This is why Asian and Middle Eastern partners increasingly view Canada as a strategic anchor. Their industries want certainty, not conflict. And ironically, Trump's tariffs, intended to pressure allies, are pushing even more investment toward Canada. Every new barrier the U.S. erects reinforces the sense that Canada is the safer long-term choice. U.S. officials understand what's happening, even if they avoid saying it publicly. Recent reporting suggests growing frustration inside the Trump administration over Canada's refusal to join U.S.-centric trade blocs. Some advisors now worry that America's tariff-heavy approach is backfiring, shifting investment and supply chains northward. The more the United States isolates itself, the more Canada becomes the preferred alternative. Washington may not acknowledge it openly, but it sees the pattern forming, and it knows what it means. Canada's $6 billion export infrastructure plan is far more than an investment announcement. It is a declaration of strategic independence. It says that Canada will not be defined by U.S. policy swings, tariff threats, or political turbulence. It will define its own future and build the capacity to reach every corner of the global economy. The world is watching. Investors are arriving, supply chains are shifting, and Canada is taking a place it has waited far too long to claim, a confident, connected, indispensable trading nation with its own global identity. The only question now is whether Canada can move fast enough to turn today's momentum into tomorrow's dominance, before geopolitical currents shift again.
Well, the reports are that U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra berated using profane language Ontario's representative in Washington.
Calls are growing for Ottawa to issue a formal diplomatic rebuke against U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra after an extraordinary scene at a black tie gala in downtown Ottawa. What began as a routine event celebrating Canada-U.S. business ties ended with stunned guests, awkward silence, and headlines across two countries. Witnesses say Hoekstra angrily confronted Ontario's trade representative, David Patterson, using language so harsh that even his own wife later apologized to the Canadian official. It was supposed to be a night of goodwill between partners. Instead, it turned into a reminder that tone can break trust faster than policy ever could. The incident has now become more than a diplomatic embarrassment. It is a test of how Canada defines respect in its most important relationship and whether Washington still knows how to treat a friend. The confrontation unfolded Monday evening at the National Gallery of Canada during an event organized by the Canada-U.S. Business Council. According to multiple reports carried by AP News and Politico Canada, Hoekstra berated David Paterson, accusing him of undermining the Trump administration through Ontario's recent ad campaign. The campaign had quoted Ronald Reagan's 1987 speech praising free trade, a message that now rings uncomfortably against Washington's new protectionist tone. Witnesses say the ambassador's outburst was public and profane. It shocked not only business leaders, but also senior diplomats present at the gala. By the next morning, Ontario Premier Doug Ford publicly demanded an apology, calling Hoekstra's conduct unacceptable and unworthy of a senior diplomat. At Carleton University, foreign policy scholar Fen Hampson published a column in Policy magazine urging Canada's Foreign Ministry, Global Affairs, to summon the U.S. ambassador for what diplomats call a démarche, a formal expression of disapproval. It is a gesture rarely used between close allies, yet in this case, even moderate voices in Ottawa said it might be necessary to preserve decorum. Within 48 hours, the episode had moved from dinner party gossip to a national debate about diplomatic boundaries. For many Canadians, it was not simply about one man losing his temper, it was about the shifting attitude coming from Washington.
And, as many have noted, he was behaving like a proconsul in some distant colonial outpost, not the ambassador of the most powerful country in the world in a friendly, neighborly setting.
To understand why this moment resonates so deeply, it helps to remember what diplomacy is built on: tone, restraint, and mutual respect. Ambassadors are trained to advocate for their government without crossing the line into intimidation. In Ottawa's view, that line was crossed the moment a U.S. envoy publicly humiliated a provincial official on Canadian soil. Foreign policy experts noted that diplomacy often depends as much on civility as on substance. The words of an ambassador can shape not just negotiations, but the overall atmosphere of trust that allows trade and security cooperation to function. When civility gives way to contempt, both sides lose credibility. What makes the Hoekstra episode different is that it did not occur behind closed doors. It happened in a professional setting, witnessed by officials, journalists, and guests who expect diplomacy to represent stability. Canada's concern, then, is not just about one confrontation, but about a broader erosion of norms that once defined relations between allies. Even as President Trump's administration continues to push for tariffs and America First policies, this incident underscores that diplomacy is not measured in duties or dollars. It is measured in the ability to disagree without losing dignity. Ottawa now faces a delicate decision: how to defend its principles without deepening the rift. Premier Doug Ford's demand for a direct apology put pressure on Global Affairs Canada to act. The ministry has several tools, ranging from private communication to a formal summoning of the ambassador. A démarche would be the diplomatic equivalent of a public reprimand, serious but short of expulsion. Officials close to the process told CBC News that such a step would be measured and respectful, not punitive. The goal is to re-establish tone, not to ignite a standoff. For Prime Minister Mark Carney's government, the episode arrives at a sensitive moment. Canada is preparing for the 2026 review of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement and is already navigating multiple layers of tariffs and investment tensions. Yet, Carney's cabinet also insists that national dignity cannot be treated as a negotiable commodity. The government's emerging approach is what analysts call quiet firmness. Rather than public confrontation,
Ottawa signals its displeasure through institutional channels, firm enough to uphold principle, calm enough to keep dialogue alive. In the world of diplomacy, restraint can speak louder than outrage, and this time, Canada appears determined to let composure be its message.
The controversy around Pete Hoekstra may seem like a personal lapse, but it reflects a deeper transformation in North American diplomacy. Over the past year, Washington's tone with allies has become increasingly transactional. Trade negotiations have been reframed as zero-sum tests of loyalty. The language of cooperation has been replaced by that of leverage and threats. In this climate, an ambassador's public outburst becomes more than a mistake. It becomes a symbol of how the U.S. now projects power. Canada's response, by contrast, offers a different model. Instead of trading insults, Ottawa reaffirms the quiet strength of institutional diplomacy. Observers note that this difference in style has real consequences. As Washington leans on pressure, Canada has deepened engagement across Asia and Europe, signing new energy and defense partnerships with South Korea and opening trade talks with ASEAN. These moves are not retaliation, they are diversification. Each step underscores a strategic shift away from dependence on a single partner whose tone has grown unpredictable. Within Canada, the incident has also struck an emotional chord. Citizens who once viewed the U.S. relationship as untouchable now talk about mutual respect as something that must be earned, not assumed. For many, the Hoekstra affair captures a turning point, a friendly nation learning to draw boundaries politely but firmly. In the end, this is not just a diplomatic story. It is a story about character, how a country responds when tested by arrogance, and how it chooses restraint over retaliation. The call for a formal rebuke of Ambassador Hoekstra has become more than a bureaucratic issue. It is a statement about respect in international life. Canada's measured reaction demonstrates that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly, through the steady voice of principle. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner and closest ally, but friendship cannot erase the need for courtesy. In diplomacy, words can build bridges or burn them. What happened at the National Gallery was a reminder that tone itself carries power. As the story unfolds, one lesson stands out clearly. In an age of tariffs, tempers, and televised politics, respect is still a diplomatic currency. And this week, Ottawa quietly reminded Washington what that currency is worth.
Trade negotiations between Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump left many investors disappointed as Canada remains the only G7 country without a trade deal with the United States. This puts Canada in a precarious position and suggests the country may need to move away from the trilateral CUSMA agreement and instead deepen its trade ties with Mexico.
What if the two neighbors America depends on most, Canada and Mexico, decided to depend on each other instead? Across North America, trade lines are being redrawn. What began as Donald Trump's attempt to dominate the continent through tariffs is now shifting power in unexpected ways. His effort to force manufacturing back to American soil has pushed Canada and Mexico to look toward one another. For decades, Washington stood at the center of North America's supply chains, but Trump's wave of import duties and industrial credits has fractured that system. What was meant to bring control has instead created a new corridor of power stretching from Montreal to Mexico City, two nations learning to work without Washington's approval. The White House's goal was clear. Trump wanted to break apart the trilateral structure of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or CUSMA, and replace it with one-on-one deals that gave the U.S. maximum leverage. Instead, the pressure has done the opposite. It has pulled Canada and Mexico into closer alignment. After months of tariff battles, steel, autos, heavy trucks, and aluminum, the United States now faces the slow isolation of its own supply network. Factories that once depended on seamless cross-border production are now dealing with paperwork, higher costs, and shrinking margins.
The U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned in early October that prolonged tariffs risk higher inflation and supply bottlenecks, while the World Trade Organization cautioned that the trade war could cut global GDP growth by more than half a percentage point if it continues into 2026. Rather than fight for individual deals with Washington, Ottawa and Mexico City have begun coordinating policy and investment. Trump's divide-and-conquer approach has become the trigger for regional cooperation. What was once a three-way partnership centered on the U.S. is now splitting into two: Canada and Mexico on one side, Washington on the other. On September 17, 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum signed a strategic partnership and a Canada-Mexico Action Plan 2025-2028. The announcement came as Trump prepared new 25% tariffs on heavy trucks effective November 1. The plan deepens cooperation in agriculture, healthcare, energy, and infrastructure, while keeping trade between Canada and Mexico tariff-free. Canada will send its agriculture minister to Mexico next month, followed by a trade mission led by Minister Dominic LeBlanc. Both governments will also expand security coordination against gun smuggling, drug trafficking, and fentanyl. Ironically, fentanyl was one of Trump's main justifications for his own tariff policy. Carney called this a new era of cooperation, a sign that Canada and Mexico are building reliability in a world where the U.S. is no longer predictable. According to Statistics Canada, about 75% of Canada's exports in 2024 went to the United States. That dependence leaves Ottawa exposed each time Washington changes its rules. Partnership with Mexico offers a safety valve. It connects Canada to lower-cost labor, diversified logistics through Pacific and Atlantic ports, and a new route into Latin America and Asia via the CPTPP. Mexico gains from Canadian capital and advanced manufacturing expertise. J.P. Morgan analysts estimate that redirecting even 5 to 10% of exports from the U.S. to Mexico could stabilize Canadian manufacturing during trade disruptions. The corridor isn't an act of protest, it's a way to survive the volatility of Trump's tariff era.
This realignment began early in 2025 when the Trump administration imposed new import duties under Section 232, citing national security. The move added a 25% tariff on heavy trucks and 35% on key auto components. In April, Stellantis shifted Jeep Compass production from Brampton, Ontario to Illinois, a $13 billion investment that created 5,000 U.S. jobs but cut 3,000 in Canada. It was a symbolic victory for Trump's reshoring agenda and a shock for Ontario's manufacturing belt. By mid-year, Canada was the only G7 nation without a trade deal with Washington. Investors reacted. The Canadian dollar fell to a 3-year low, and unemployment rose to 7.1%, according to Statistics Canada's September data. Instead of retaliating, Carney held back. Ottawa skipped counter tariffs and turned its focus south, to Mexico. That decision now defines Canada's new playbook: build strength through cooperation, not confrontation. What started as a tariff war has turned into a regional reset. Trump's economic walls were meant to protect American jobs, but they've redirected trade around them. Canada and Mexico are quietly building an economic corridor linking industries, ports, and supply chains, an alliance that could lessen Washington's gravitational pull on the continent. With the 2026 CUSMA review approaching, the two partners are already aligned for whatever comes next. For now, one fact stands out. When Trump tried to split North America, he didn't just fracture trade lines, he created a new one, a line that runs not through the United States, but around it. President Trump stood before the world's leaders and sneered.
It's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, in my opinion. Best-selling hat. Trump was right about everything. And I don't say that in a braggadocious way, but it's true. I've been right about everything.
Donald Trump returned to the United Nations this September, but instead of a serious diplomatic moment, it became a spectacle. He opened by complaining about an escalator, telling delegates,
I ended 7 wars, dealt with the leaders of each and every one of these countries, and never even received a phone call from the United Nations. All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped right in the middle.
What followed was nearly an hour of bravado and insult. At one point, he declared,
Countries are going to hell.
The scene drew laughter and headlines, but for all the wrong reasons. What was supposed to be leadership on the world stage came across as grievance and performance. While Trump was absorbed in this one-man show in New York, another story was unfolding across the border. The American economy, particularly in industries tied to Canada, was showing real signs of strain. The contradictions in his speech were glaring. He called climate policy a sham, insisting,
If you don't get away from this green scam, your country is going to fail.
He mocked the UN as ineffective, saying,
And now all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up.
Yet in a private meeting just afterward, he switched tone, telling the Secretary General,
Our country is behind the United Nations 100%. I think the potential of the United Nations is incredible, really incredible.
This disconnect is not just about words. It reflects a broader pattern. The reciprocal tariff regime rolled out earlier this year was supposed to restore fairness, but it has left scars with America's closest allies. Canada, facing duties on steel, aluminum, and autos, has not only resisted, but also pulled back in ways that strike at everyday economic ties. Public opinion north of the border has soured, and that shift is now visible in the numbers.
Canadians continue to shun the U.S. We've heard from U.S. travel operators, tour operators just across the border, upstate New York, or those northern states are feeling the impact of not having as many Canadians traveling south of the border, particularly during the busy and all-important summer travel months.
Statistics Canada reported in July 2025 that Canadian return trips from the United States dropped more than 32% compared with July 2024. Car trips, usually day visits for shopping or gas, were down 35%. Air travel fell 16%. For the second consecutive month, more Americans traveled to Canada than Canadians to the U.S., reversing a long-standing trend. This matters because Canada has been the single largest source of foreign visitors to the U.S. According to the U.S. Travel Association, Canadians made about 20 million visits in 2024, generating around $20 billion in spending and supporting more than 140,000 American jobs. With travel now falling, those dollars and jobs are disappearing. The impact is already visible. Tour operators in upstate New York and the northern Midwest say bookings are weak. Air Canada reported that revenue on its U.S. routes fell by 11% in the second quarter of 2025. Local business owners in small towns along the border also report emptier parking lots, weaker restaurant traffic, and a sharp drop in retail sales compared with last summer. Each of these figures points to the same reality. Tariffs and tension have created a boycott effect that is costing Americans real income. Trump built his second term on promises of strength. At the UN, he declared,
Trump was right about everything.
Yet the evidence shows otherwise. Tariffs meant to pressure Canada are instead draining American communities. Tourism, airlines, and border economies are suffering precisely because of policies meant to protect them. The irony is stark. While Trump made headlines for taunting world leaders in New York, the real story was happening quietly across the northern border. Canadians are staying home, billions of dollars in spending are evaporating, and American jobs are on the line. The spectacle at the UN may have satisfied a taste for confrontation, but the cost is measured in livelihoods. What was meant to project strength is instead turning into one of the clearest examples of a policy backfire.
Now to the latest on President Trump's war on wind power. Last month, the administration abruptly halted construction on a nearly finished $6 billion 65-turbine wind farm off the coast of New England known as Revolution Wind.
Connecticut and Rhode Island are suing the Trump administration over its decision to halt work on a nearly completed offshore wind farm.
Only in Washington could a $6 billion wind farm, 80% finished and built to power 350,000 homes, be shut down overnight by a president who calls wind worthless.
This is a project that has been in the making for nearly a decade. 80% of it is complete. The cables are laid back from the turbines to the shore. Nearly all of them are done. And the Trump administration abruptly stopped the project, which gave no basis for that stop work order because it wasn't possible to give one.
Revolution Wind, off the coast of New England, was meant to be a flagship project for clean energy in America. Instead, it now stands as a symbol of uncertainty. Workers have been sent home, ships and cranes sit idle, and investors are left wondering whether federal permits mean anything at all. While this is happening in the United States, Canada is busy promoting itself as an energy superpower, pushing ahead with offshore wind projects in Nova Scotia. The contrast could not be sharper. Is America throwing away its future while its neighbor builds one with determination? The halt has immediate consequences. Union workers expected steady jobs through next year, but paychecks have vanished. Local governments also warned that families will continue paying high electricity bills because the project's cheaper power is stuck in limbo. In response, the Attorneys General of Rhode Island and Connecticut have sued the White House. They argue the stop order of August 22nd had no legal basis, overturning nearly a decade of reviews and permits. With construction already 80% complete, the states are asking a federal judge for urgent relief to restart work. At the center of this fight lies a deeper political struggle. President Trump and senior officials have long dismissed wind and solar as unreliable. They point to days without sun or calm seas as proof that renewable energy cannot power the nation. Yet the facts of Revolution Wind tell a different story. Contracts signed in 2019 locked in electricity at 9.8 cents per kilowatt hour for the next 20 years. In southern New England, where average retail electricity prices often double that figure, this would have provided cheaper bills for households. In addition, ISO New England, the regional grid operator, has said that new wind capacity is essential to keep the grid stable as coal plants close and gas supplies remain limited at the end of pipeline networks. Instead of delivering these benefits, Washington's sudden reversal sends a chilling signal. If a project with nearly a decade of approvals and 80% completion can be stopped by a one-page order, what developer will risk billions on the next venture? The result is a growing divide between ideology in Washington and the economic reality facing families in New England. That divide becomes even clearer when compared with Canada. In Nova Scotia, the federal government and the province are moving forward with plans to build up to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. Ottawa has established a major projects office to fast-track reviews and is labeled offshore wind as a project of national interest. Developers already have environmental approvals in place, and transmission lines are being prepared for integration with green hydrogen facilities. Instead of halting progress, Canada is laying the foundation for new industries, export opportunities, and long-term energy security. The United States, by contrast, is freezing a nearly finished project that promised cheaper power and thousands of jobs. It is a striking picture of two neighbors heading in opposite directions. One is dismantling confidence in renewable energy, the other is building momentum to become a leader. The question now is whether America will continue down a path of uncertainty or whether it will recognize that clean energy is not just about politics, but about real jobs, real savings, and a stable future.